Have you ever had that experience where you're perhaps with a good friend and suddenly something random pops into your mind, and when you say it, your friend tells you they were just thinking exactly the same thing? This kind of experience is a common one, especially among close friends. Often it can be the result of something that Milton Erickson described as subliminal auditory stimulation. In his paper, Respiratory Rhythm in Trance Induction, the role of minimal sensory cues in normal and trance behaviour, the famous psychiatrist Milton Erickson describes some of his experiences which led to him discovering and then utilising breathing to influence others. When Milton Erickson was in school, he was confused by the different breathing patterns that his classmates and teachers would have when they were singing songs. What confused him more was that even those who weren't singing along, but were just listening, would be breathing the same as those who were singing. Erickson asked his teachers, but they didn't seem to understand his question. He wanted to know why, as people were listening to others singing, they would tighten their throats, change their breathing. Erickson observed that people would change their breathing and then suddenly start to hum or sing. That it was common to see people seemingly silent and thoughtful and changing their breathing before spontaneously humming or singing. He noticed on many occasions where someone would change their breathing, then the person who perhaps is sat beside that person would change their breathing to match the breathing of the original person. And they would start to sing or hum the same song, despite the fact that there was no previous mention of the song or of the idea of singing. Erickson noticed that when people marched, they matched breathing patterns with each other. This seemed to occur spontaneously, and whenever Erickson asked teachers about this, they just dismissed his observations as being foolish. So, at the time, he decided to keep quiet and just explore this for himself. Erickson learned to breathe in different ways, learning breathing patterns for different songs. He would then sit down quietly beside others and pretend to be absorbed in reading a book, while he was actually focused on breathing the different songs. Initially, he wasn't very good at accurately doing the breathing pattern of the songs, and he found that those he sat next to would get irritable. But they wouldn't know why, because they wouldn't consciously have noticed his breathing. With practice, Erickson improved. He tested breathing songs and gently and quietly humming songs. In both cases, he found that this elicited the same response. That the person he was sat next to would start to hum or sing the song themselves. When questioned if he had been humming, they would acknowledge that they were aware of this and that they started humming or singing because they heard and recognised the song that he was humming. If he'd just been breathing the song, the person would report that the song just popped into their mind and that they just started humming or singing that song. They didn't recognise that they had been influenced and didn't attribute their decision to start singing or humming with Ericksons breathing. As Erickson entered high school, he learned about the contagion of yawns. So he practiced being able to yawn to trigger yawns in others. He couldn't understand how yawning, which he saw as a form of breathing, could be as contagious as humming popular tunes. And like with encouraging people to hum, it led to physical behaviours, not just a change in the person's breathing. He started to experiment with yawning. Yawning at times people were reciting things to see what impact it would have. He found some people to be highly responsive to his non-verbal behaviour. Erickson was curious about the fact that everybody breathed and yet nobody paid attention. He recognised that breathing was a key part of any sort of vocalisation and vocal behaviour, but others didn't seem to recognise this. As Erickson continued to explore this, he encountered someone who stuttered. He found himself to be completely bewildered by the breathing pattern of this person when he thought of talking and when he actually spoke. The breathing pattern of this person made him feel very uneasy and uncomfortable. Erickson had an experience which made him largely avoid copying this pattern of breathing after a couple of times of practicing with it to see how it impacts on others. He matched the breathing pattern of a classmate who was reciting something, and then he changed his breathing and moved his breathing into using the breathing pattern of the stutterer. And he noticed that it made the classmate uncertain and hesitant in their reciting. This frightened Erickson and convinced him further that people communicated with each other at a breathing level of awareness, unknown to them. He realised that you could non-verbally and in an unrecognised way communicate with others, and that it was more effective when the person being influenced wasn't aware of what you were doing. By college, Erickson had increased his skill with nonverbal influence. He had a professor who hated the course that he was teaching and resented the students. Erickson felt that this person was fair game for practicing with. He would sit in the professor's classes, nodding and shaking his head in agreement with what the professor said, so that he would increase rapport between himself and the professor. He always made sure to synchronise the head movements with the professor's respiration. By doing this, he was cross-matching with the professor, a process where you match one thing, like breathing, with something else, like moving your head, rather than just matching, which is where you would, for example, match someone's breathing with your own breathing, or match their head movements with your own head movements. After a while, the breathing and head movements were fully synchronized, so that if Erickson slowed down his head movements, the professor's breathing would slow down. If Erickson sped up his head movements, the professor's breathing would speed up. This would trigger speech problems in the professor as the professor was lecturing. Erickson continued over the decades to explore the power of communication through breathing. Erickson noted that a 5-year-old patient of his remarked at the end of a session that every night his mum sings him to sleep, but you breathe me to sleep. Erickson explained that the child was right and that it is common for children under about the age of 8 to realise that Erickson is influencing them using his respiratory rhythm technique, where adults just don't notice. His daughter, Betty Alice, commented to Erickson that ever since I was a little girl I sensed in some way that your breathing in itself was a hypnotic technique that you could use without anything else. Then when you used my college roommate in a demonstration as a resistant hypnotic subject, I really understood what it was that you were doing. Betty Alice continues to tell the story about how her roommate and everyone else present thought that Erickson was just casually discussing how you can help resistant patients. But all of a sudden she noticed that Erickson was breathing in a peculiar way, and her roommate's eyes slowly closed, and the roommate was in a deep somnambulistic trance. She shared that she could see how, unknown to the roommate, she had just followed along to Ericksons Breathing. She concluded that she saw how Erickson had covered up what he had done by eliciting an arm catalepsy, and everyone was watching, thinking that it was the arm catalepsy that was the actual induction, and that had he told them what he had really done, they probably wouldn't have understood him. In his paper, Erickson shared that some physicians recorded a demonstration of his, and while reviewing it over and over at home, trying to work out what Erickson did, the physician's young children interrupted to say that the man didn't say anything. He just changed his voice a little so that he could breathe different, so the person will wake up. The physicians doubted their children's analysis, and so they replayed the tapes again and again, asking the children to point out where this happens. And the children responded, stating when Erickson would change his breathing for the person to fall asleep, and when he changed his breathing for the person to wake up. The physicians shared this with Erickson, almost as if not being sure whether they would look stupid doing so or not. And Erickson confirmed that the children were indeed correct. This technique is one of my favourites, one I've spent years practicing, and is one of the main techniques that I use with people. Writing some of the examples of me using this technique into what the Hypnotic Assassin does in my The Hypnotic Assassin novel. It's a technique that I highly recommend all therapists learn and master. Where Erickson started out breathing familiar tunes to influence others to hum or sing those tunes and think that it came from within them rather than feeling influenced, with practice you can breathe sentences that you would like people to be thinking, which, like with songs, need to be things that the person would recognise if they started having it develop, obviously, in their mind. So, not complex words that the person may not know. This technique, on first hearing about it, may sound scary to some. The idea of planting thoughts into the minds of others. People may worry about the idea that you could plant a thought to perhaps carry out something immoral or bad or harmful in some way. But we have thoughts all the time which, if acted on, could be seen as wrong. So we choose not to act on those thoughts. The same applies here, that just because someone starts to have a certain thought doesn't mean that they have to act on that thought. For someone to decide to act on the thought or idea being presented, it has to be something that they are comfortable with acting on. If someone starts to feel themselves drifting into hypnosis and relaxing, and they aren't comfortable with this, then, just like when you notice you're tired and nearly falling asleep, but you don't actually want to fall asleep, you respond by doing something to increase your alertness. There's a saying that the meaning of communication is in how it is received. It isn't what was intended to be communicated that is the important thing. It's in how the communication is received that's important. So a person not wanting to be hypnotised, who starts to feel like they want to close their eyes and enter hypnosis, without having any idea that you're the one who's influencing them, may respond to this communication not with actually entering hypnosis or relaxing, but instead with getting up, moving around, moving their attention around, making themselves a drink of coffee. In therapy, someone having the thought that they'll tell you everything about perhaps a deeply personal situation may think about telling you because you're encouraging that thought in their mind, but feel uncomfortable with the idea of telling you, and so they decide not to tell you. And we experience this kind of thing all of the time, like seeing someone we really like and thinking, I want to go and tell them how much I like them. And they may be saying to themselves, go over and tell them that you like them. But they feel uncomfortable with this, and they never end up actually telling that person. Other times, the thought in the person's mind may be something that they are comfortable with, like if you are sitting next to someone and encouraging them to think, would you like a cup of tea? And after sitting there a while, the person spontaneously stands up and asks, would you like a cup of tea? As the thought matches the context and the time and is an agreeable thought to them, and one which is totally reasonable for them in that moment to ask. So, have you ever used this technique, or are you planning on giving it a go? Or do you have any thoughts about this technique, or even about the idea that we naturally synchronise and naturally influence each other unknowingly with our breathing? Share your thoughts in the comments section, because I'd be really interested in continuing this discussion and seeing what your thoughts are about this. And if you found this interesting, please consider giving this video a thumbs up, because it really does help the channel. And thank you for taking the time to watch this video all the way to the end. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.